definitely got the feel.
Pretty fun to work with directors. Okay, it's getting late, so we better start. Okay.
All right.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out this really balmy, springy afternoon. It's a good day to get out. I'm going to take this off so you can hear me a little bit better. I'm Christine Brown. I am an interpretive historian here at the Montana Historical Society. I work in the Outreach and Education Department, and I am delighted today to introduce Austin Haney. His program, The Lost West, we'll talk about French history in North America, and I'm not going to give away any more than that at this point, except to talk a little bit about Austin. He is a longtime researcher, interpreter, and reenactor, focused, and his passion is the American and Canadian West. He is a 2020 graduate of the University of Montana History Program, and he is currently an interpreter at the Lewis and Clark Foundation, but he's also been an interpreter with the Lewis and Clark Honor Guard, the U.S. National Park Service, and the U.S. Forest Service. He's routinely called upon to relate living history for groups such as Montana State Parks, Friends of Fort Owen, the Lewis and Clark National Heritage Trail Foundation, Portage Route Chapter, and others. He also has been able to work with film in Montana, specifically roles in documentaries about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the life of Chief Tondoy. He had a background role in Yellowstone 1883, which we've been hearing a lot about lately. And he has worked as a costumer for the docuseries Into the Wild Frontier. So please welcome Austin Haney. And here he is.
Well, bonjour, bienvenue, comment ça va? Well, of course I got to speak a little French in this program if we're going to be talking about the Lost West here. So a little background on why I decided to do this program. French history, particularly in the United States, it's oftentimes kind of put on the back burner. It's not really focused on. I have had a passion for Canadian history for a very long time. My dad's family is from there. And this was really kind of a passion project to sort of connect our two countries and sort of the French experience in between. So without further ado, let's dive into the Lost West. So a lot of us scholars of the Lewis and Clark period, we know this map by heart. This is done by Aaron Arrowsmith. This depicts the world in North America as Lewis and Clark knew it. This is sort of the dawn of the 19th century. And of course, you've got the fledgling United States over here on the eastern seaboard, ending in the Mississippi River. Beyond that, Spanish territories in the southwest, and a British behemoth in the north. But just a couple generations prior, this map looked completely different. But there is one vestige of that old world, and I might use the laser pointer, but right up there. Believe it or not, the French Empire still exists. You don't believe me? Well, there's two little islands there, Saint Pierre and Miquelon. When France relinquished its North American territories in 1763, they kept a hold of these two little fishing islands. No one really knows why. But even today, they are actually French territory. They vote in French national elections. They have a representative in the Senate. So, believe it or not, Canada has a maritime border with France. But that's just the one remaining piece of a vast empire stretching from the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River in the east, south to the bayous of Louisiana, north to the icy waters of Hudson Bay, and all the way west to the spine of the Rocky Mountains. This empire was not a small affair, and it has a lot of diverse people and stories that we're going to kind of dive into. But first of all, we got to start at the beginning. Quebec is the cradle of New France. From the earliest explorations into what is now Canada, it really is centered on Quebec. Some of the earliest folks that we're talking about would be Giovanni Caboto, or John Cabot for English speakers, and Jacques Cartier. Now, in addition to these guys, you've got some French fishermen coming in, Basques exploring the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, but nobody really stays until this chap right here. Samuel de Champlain, he is the poor son of a fishing family from the south of France. And at this time, in the late 1500s, there are a lot of imperial wars going on. France is sort of becoming its own nation state. And he excels and proves himself on the battlefield in France, wins favor with the French royal family, and is actually sent out to establish a colony in the lands that Cartier's explored. Now, heading up the St. Lawrence River, he's being piloted by Algonquin guides, and they come to this place where the river narrows. The Algonquin word for where the river narrows is Quebec. This is the start of French Canada. But it's not the easiest situation. You are dealing with English, you're dealing with the Basque, and a very powerful native nation, the Iroquois, to the south. And the early French in Canada get pushed around quite a bit. Winters as well, it's a harsh environment. How many of you guys have ever been to Canada in the winter? Yeah, pretty darn cold, right? About a month ago, they were doing this little temperature reading, the 10 coldest places on Earth. 8 of the 10 were in Canada. So if you are an early Frenchman in Quebec at this time, it's not the most pleasant experience. But the colony persists on and actually comes to thrive. This is largely because Champlain starts this pattern that really kind of goes through. It's the theme of New France all the way up until the very end. And that is alliances with indigenous peoples. Champlain strikes a middle ground with the people around him. He's not lording over them like the Spanish. He's not following an English model of economic dominance and eventual removal. He is essentially working as partners. It's not always perfect, sometimes far from it. But so long as each side tries and lives up to their end of the bargain, they will thrive and survive against larger enemies to the south. Champlain also starts another trend in New France, that of exploration. These guys are going everywhere looking for economic opportunities, amongst them the fur trade, actually. So there are two main routes out of New France and into the hinterlands of North America at this time, the north and the south. Heading up the St. Lawrence River, you can either end up going all the way up through Lake Huron, into Lake Superior, and into what they call the Pays d'en Haut. You can go the south route, which will eventually take you over into the Ohio River watershed and down to the lower Mississippi. And gentlemen from New France, they start exploring, trying to capitalize on this rich water highway. Some of the most famous, of course, La Salle in the Ohio country. He heads down in the 1670s and actually gets all the way down to the lower Mississippi. Meanwhile, in the north, Joliet and Marquette, probably two famous names a lot of you have heard. Marquette, Michigan. It is kind of a funny story there. A priest and a trader, so a very unlikely combination. But they head up all the way up to the head of the Pays d'en Haut and all through upper Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota. They are really kind of this upper Midwest. They even head down the Mississippi River and are the first Europeans to sight the mouth of the Missouri River. They were a little terrified of it. They didn't want to go up it, but this is the first sort of mention of a river that's going to be very important to our story going further on. All this exploration into the Mississippi drainage leads to the foundation of Louisiana, the colony of Louisiana. And that effectively is the entire Mississippi drainage. So stretching from modern-day western Pennsylvania south to Louisiana and as far up as Montana and Alberta. Forts, missions, villages, they all soon follow after this. One of the most famous is Kaskaskia, which is a name that figures very prominently into the Lewis and Clark story. That's founded about 1690. So, in addition to explorers, you've got businessmen coming out of New France. It's a very poor colony, agriculturally speaking. You're only going to really get enough to provide for the colony itself. The real riches to be made in New France comes from furs. And two of the guys that come out here to the Pays d'Anjou are Radisson and Grissier. They are friends from Quebec. They head out and they start trading in the upper country. Now, while they're there, they start hearing from natives of rich furs far to the north and rivers that empty into an icy, salty sea, Hudson Bay. And of course, fur-bearing animals, they're better, the pelts are more prime in colder weather. So they overstay their trading license and try and capitalize on the furs coming out of Hudson Bay. Now, this is kind of a problem. At the time, the way trading licenses are handed out in France, to be a trader, you need to approach the governor, you need to get official permission. Most of the time, the licenses are given out for a year. So they come back, they've overstayed their license, but they think everything's going to be all fine and dandy. We'll tell them of this rich economic opportunity, and everything will be okay. Well, unfortunately for them, it wasn't. They get back to Quebec City, and the governor confiscates their furs. This is a really dangerous place at this time. They're risking their lives to make money out here. And effectively, all that risk, all that investment that they put into it, gone. They're probably not too happy, right? So they start thinking to themselves, what is a group of people in this world that have absolutely no morals and scruples at all and will do anything to make a quick buck? Well, every good Frenchman knows the answer. The English in Boston. So they actually head down to Boston and commit the unforgivable sin of working with the English. And these Boston merchants, they're listening to these guys talk on and on about these rich furs in Hudson Bay. They start thinking to themselves, that's actually not a bad idea. It's so good of an idea, in fact, that they send Radisson and Grissier all the way to London for an audience with His Majesty King Charles himself. Now, these guys coming from hardscrabble New France, they're a little more apt to hop on a good economic opportunity. These rich English lords in London, who already have made their money and don't need to worry about it, probably not going to be as hot to trot, so to speak. But there is one guy in court who enthusiastically embraces this idea, a fellow by the name of Prince Rupert. He's the king's cousin, a very eccentric and weird figure. King didn't really like him that much, but the guy had money and was the life of the party. He was more than willing to throw out a couple bucks to these Frenchmen and send them on their way, and hopefully it pays dividends. Well, this is the beginning of the very famous, or infamous, depending on who you are, Hudson Bay Company, which is still in existence today. Believe me, I know, I've shopped there. It's more like a shopping mall now, but c'est la vie. So, after this, we kind of have a start of a new northern rival to New France. The Hudson Bay Company is going to pose some problems, and the French want to get rid of them. But we'll come to that here. One of the biggest issues at this time are imperial wars that spill over into North America. Things like King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, or as they're known in other circles, the War of the Grand Alliance, War of the Spanish Succession, War of the Austrian Succession, etc., etc. There are almost too many of these to count. Essentially, it all boils down to people in Europe fighting over petty squabbles of who's going to be king and who's not. What does that concern the folks over in North America? Well, that question will be answered about 1776. But what happens is raids go back and forth between these English, later British colonies, and the French. And the French get this bright idea about those pesky Englishmen up on Hudson Bay. We're going to invade and force them out. So from about 1690 up until 1713, the French formally attack English establishments on Hudson Bay no less than 9 times. And they're largely successful. They sack Hudson Bay Company trading posts, destroy all of their trading goods, confiscate furs, and by and large, the English are driven from the bay. But this comes back to European powers not really understanding North American issues. When the treaties are finally signed, ending these attacks on Hudson Bay in 1713, the French formally relinquish their claims on the bay. Now, in trying to get rid of Hudson Bay Company, they actually accidentally encourage it to stay and work harder. In fact, so much so that they build this. This is Prince of Wales Fort in Churchill, Manitoba, right on the shore of Hudson Bay. Here's a fun fact about how out of the way and ridiculous this place is. Churchill, Manitoba is famous for exactly 3 things in this world. This fort, the Northern Lights, and having just about more polar bears than anywhere else on Earth. It's out there. But by 1713, the bay is here to stay. So we kind of settle into a Cold War period after 1713. There's not really a lot of raiding going on. The English and the French, they're kind of okay with each other for now. So that leaves time for exploration. And one of these guys, another gentleman from New France, Pierre Gaultier de Varennes, Sieur de la Vérendrye, oh, that's a mouthful. He is serving at a fur trading post at Kaministiquia on the western end of Lake Superior. It's sort of that corner where Minnesota's arm and Ontario kind of meet. That's roughly where we're talking about geographically. So he's hanging out there, trading for furs, and he starts hearing tales from local Cree and Ojibwe about a river that comes out of a big lake and flows to a western sea. So this tantalizes La Vérendrye. He needs to find this sea. So he starts heading out west of Lake Superior, which is kind of the first formal expeditions into the outer country beyond the Pays d'Anjou. And he reaches Lake Winnipeg, Lake of the Woods, and considers this region the key of the continent. He starts figuring rather quickly that, well, these rivers probably go to Hudson Bay, so no use following them that direction, but they offer a vital highway into the heart of the continent. From the south, you can head up the Red River of the north and into the Dakota Prairies in Minnesota. To the west, you can go up the Saskatchewan and end up at the spine of the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. So there's a lot you can do with these rivers, even if it doesn't lead to that sea. So while he's at one of his posts near Lake Winnipeg, he's actually, again, informed by natives of something very interesting that he ought to check out. He starts hearing tales of Indians who live in houses like Frenchmen, who dress like them, who have the goods of Frenchmen. And how many of you ever heard of the myth of the Welsh Indians? Yeah, it's kind of playing off of that European dream of finding people out there like that. So he heads south, and he doesn't meet any French Indians. He meets the Mandan, who live in vast earth lodge villages and are kind of a major trading center on the upper Missouri. it's kind of funny. Most modern scholars now, we kind of believe that the folks that told them about these French Indians were probably just trying to get La Vérendrye to go away. So these Mandan villages are going to figure very prominently into the explorations of his sons. By 1740, La Vérendrye himself, he's almost 60 years old. He's getting too old for this kind of stuff. But his sons are in their prime. So in 1742, they actually head down to the Mandan villages, hoping to meet with a people called the Gens de Chevaux, who know the way to the Western Sea, or so they've been told. Well, they wait and wait and wait, and by July, the Gens de Chevaux have not come. So they decide to hitchhike across country, try to find them themselves. They wander for months and months, meeting various peoples throughout the region of what we now probably think is central Wyoming, but no Western Sea is found. The unfortunate part about these guys is we don't know exactly where they went because their navigational instruments broke literally almost at the beginning of their journey. What we wouldn't give for modern GPS with the Chevrolet and his brother. But what they do leave behind that we know for certain is this. It's a little lead plate about yay big that is inscribed on one side, talking about the reign of Louis XV, Petrus Gaultier de la Vérendrye. Of course, it's all in Latin. But on the other side, scrawled in with a knife, are the names of the Chevrolet, his brother, and their two companions, and the date. It was March of 1743. They left this behind outside of an Arikara village near Pierre, South Dakota. Funny enough, 1913, 3 teenagers were playing on a hill outside of town and kicked that up out of the dirt. No joke. And now it sits actually in the South Dakota Historical Society in Pierre. So thankfully, we know at least one place where they were at. But it's really not going to be of any consequence. It's 1743, tides are changing in New France. La Vérendrye himself dies planning another Western expedition in 1749. But about that time, 1750, we start getting a little bit of a hotter time with the English, the British at this point. We've got boundary disputes in the Ohio country. So remember what I said about Louisiana comprising the entire Mississippi drainage? So the French claim land based off of watersheds. Being they're the first Europeans to set foot in the watershed, well, by right of discovery, they think they own it. Never mind what the indigenous peoples say, but what's going on at the same time is the colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, that famous 13 that we probably all know from grade school, they have claims to that same land in their royal charters. A very prominent one is Virginia. If you ever look at some of the maps of the original 13 colonies, you'll notice that they go all east to west, roughly on their borders. That's the English model. They don't care if some French guy 100 years ago was on that river. It's all about economic control. So the English are actually I need to switch to French. My English is failing. But the English are sending in traders. Settlers are heading into the Ohio Valley. And all this is not good for the French. They're at a very distinct population disadvantage. You've got about 1.5 million or so people clustered in the 13 colonies. You've got about 70,000 in the entire vast expanse of New France. That's like the equivalent of taking the town of Missoula and spreading it over most of North America. Yeah, not looking good for our friends of the fleur-de-lis. But things start ramping up after a little thing called the Jumonville Affair. Now, this involves a young, enterprising British officer by the name of George Washington. Probably heard that name before, right? No, totally not. But he is heading out and on behalf of the government of Virginia, and he's in the Ohio country to tell them French who's boss and get off our land. At this time, you've got French and British parties going back and forth in a comical ballet, where one arrives at the fort of another, says, "Get off my land," and then they have a very nice time whining and dining each other until they go home. And Washington is on his way to one of these when he actually runs across the party of French envoy Jumonville. And one thing leads to another, and Washington's party ends up killing Jumonville and most of the Frenchmen with him. Quite a great start for America's first president, right? Well, this blows up into an international incident. For the first time, global war happens not because of European squabbles, but because of North American issues. This turns into something we call the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. And the French are actually very successful early on. They are relying on that middle ground, native alliances. Since there are so few of them, unite, survive, you'll get through it. And they, for the first couple battles in the war, actually do pretty darn well. The British are heading up in their columns just like they would in any European battle. The French, the tactics mainly are a mix of French regulars, Canadian militia, and natives. They hit them from all sides. You guys ever seen the movie Last of the Mohicans? Yeah, you know that famous scene where all the British are marching with their flags and red coats through the woods, and Magua and the warriors are off on the sides waiting to just pick them off? That's actually remarkably accurate. That is sort of how the French fought. Now, of course, once the English catch on to this, well, that's a little bit of a different story. But so long as they have their native allies, they stand a chance at least keeping the British out. But all that really starts to fade away at a little place called Fort William Henry, ironically where that movie takes place. They win, the French and the natives, and the English are heading out. But something happens that completely disintegrates the French alliance. The natives don't want to wage war on European terms, and the Europeans don't want to wage war on native terms. There's a little fellow by the name of Louis-Joseph Marquis de Montcalm, a very important figure in that movie as well as French-Canadian history. He is a proper man from France. He hasn't grown up with this whole idea of the middle ground. You read his letters, he does not like his allies at all. He is horrified at the idea of going to war for captives, for scalps, for plunder. And he wants to do extended European-style campaigns. The natives don't want to do this. They're used to going to war in the summer and the fall and then heading home, and that's it. They don't want to be bossed around by Monsieur le Marquis. They want to go home. So they actually start fraying and coming apart at the seams to where by the end of the 1758-1759 campaigns, Montcalm is sitting with just Canadian militia and French regulars. This is not a good recipe. And it all backfires in 1759. The fortress of Louisbourg, the gateway to the St. Lawrence, to Quebec itself, falls, leaving the capital open to invasion. And of course, this right here, this painting, it's one of my favorite historical paintings ever. It depicts, in my opinion, one of the most single cataclysmic events in the history of North America. Had this gone differently, we may be looking at a different map today. But that's a program for another time. This right here is the infamous Battle of Quebec, the Plains of Abraham. So Quebec, of course, where the river narrows. Its geography both helps and hurts it. This is about as far up as ocean-going vessels can sail on the river. Good for folks in Montreal, they can't get you, but if you're in Quebec, kind of a problem when the British fleet shows up on your doorstep. Thankfully, The cliffs and the river provide defenses from land attack. But there is a fellow with the British that's going to cause a major headache for our French friends. The general, James Wolfe. He's young, about 24, 25, about my age actually. And he gets the broad idea of, well, they're expecting us to come across and hit it at the main wall. They aren't expecting us to go straight up the cliff. And so they do. Somehow, some way, through the night, the British under Wolfe scale the cliffs above Quebec and end up on the Plains of Abraham. And this sends the French in the city into a panic. Again, they thought this was okay. They didn't think that this was going to happen. They rush out to try and meet this threat. And in their haste, the British, who have formed well-trained lines, they fire 2 volleys into the disorganized French and send them running back to the gates of Montreal. Montcalm himself is actually mortally wounded. Wolfe as well. So, not a good day to be a general here at Quebec. But this is really the death knell of New France. Those 2 volleys, it's like a funeral bell. The French hold out in Montreal for a year, but by this point, it's practically over. The cultural heart of the colony is gone. Treaty of 1763, they actually relinquish all their claims to Canada. They abandon it to save colonies elsewhere. In addition, they send off Louisiana to the Spanish, giving the eastern chunk, the Ohio country, to the British. This is sort of the ultimate catastrophe for the French population in North America. This is the world turned upside down for them. Now we come to Spanish Louisiana, as I like to call it, Spain's unwanted misfit colony. Nobody really wanted it. The French didn't really do anything with it, and the Spanish were not about to change that. Here's the thing, we often like to think of the French and the Spanish as being arm in arm, buddy-buddy, walking down the yellow brick road singing Kumbaya, right? That's not the case throughout much of the 18th century. Case in point, the Velasra Expedition. This is a group led out of Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1720 by Pedro Velasra. What they're trying to do is, for a while now, the French traders on the Mississippi have been filtering in guns and manufactured goods that undercut Spain's colonies in New Mexico and Texas. So Pedro's out there to show them French who's boss. And he gets about to modern Omaha, Nebraska, when he runs into Missouri, Oto, and Pawnee allies of the French, and according to Spanish rumors, actual Frenchmen. And funny enough, this painting right here actually is a wonderful visual record of the Velasra Expedition. There's old Pedro himself, lying dead in the red coat, blood coming down. Quite a flattering portrait. But this is really the end of Spanish influence that far north out of New Mexico, at least directly anyways. Now, about the same time as La Vérendrye is hanging out with the Mandan in North Dakota, 2 brothers in Kaskaskia, I told you that town would be important, right? 2 brothers in Kaskaskia are thinking, well, there are riches in Santa Fe. Let's tap into it. Let's establish a trade connection. So they head up the Missouri River, thinking it will take them to New Mexico. They get about as far as South Dakota when they realize, yeah, this river's not going the right way. So they turn around and head back down and actually cut across the Platte River. They're the first Europeans we know after the Velasers to come through that area. And they start cutting across Colorado, actually, to La Junta area, which is a place where I worked before, Bent's Old Fort. And they, from there, head to Santa Fe, pioneering what becomes the Santa Fe Trail. They reach Santa Fe and are actually given quite a warm reception. The Spanish are open to trading with the French. Because at this time, Santa Fe is at the very tail end of the El Camino de Real. That's this royal road that heads up from Mexico City. It's the trade route going through there. Now, it takes a long time to get to Santa Fe from Mexico City. Not a lot of material goods are coming up there. So any way that they can get a nice Christmas present, doesn't matter if it's from the French or from Mexico City, the Spanish in Santa Fe are very interested in this possibility. Well, they go back to Kaskaskia and they say, good news, everybody, the Spanish want to trade. So they head out with another expedition. They get about halfway there when they're robbed of their horses and forced to go back. They try a third time. Third time's the charm, right? We're finally going to establish that connection. They get to Santa Fe, and the Spanish are not so friendly anymore. They actually lock one of the brothers up, throw away the key, and he disappears in a Mexico City jail, never to be heard from again. Even to this day, we actually do not know what happened to him. So that kind of kills the French and Spanish connection in the 1730s and 40s. Now, this isn't to say that Spanish Louisiana is all conflict and doing nothing. There's actually some good stuff that comes from Spain's administration of Louisiana. They try exploring the Missouri at this time. Cities like St. Louis, St. Charles, they are founded in the Spanish era. At this time, Louisiana also experiences a population growth. People are fleeing British-held Canada for friendlier territory in the south. You might know of the Acadians. They're a very famous version of that. Now, other people going up the Missouri, you've got folks like Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, McKay and Evans, a very weird duo of an experienced trader and an inexperienced Welsh ethnographer. But they head up in the 1790s and really kind of set the table, if you will, for Lewis and Clark, who will come up the Missouri very shortly after this. Other people out there, we've got a mysterious figure by the name of Menard. He's living with the Mandan, and he claims to have gone to the Rocky Mountains several times. There's also the mysterious Charles Luray, who claims that he did the same thing. We don't really know too much about these guys. Menard himself was illiterate. The only reason why we even know he exists is because people who were literate wrote about him. So that could be an interesting project for somebody down the line. If you somehow find out who this Menard was, let me know. But this all changes. Spain gives Louisiana back to France with the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800. Now, I could go on for a very long time about the Louisiana Purchase, but that is not the purpose of this program here. What you really need to know about Louisiana Purchase is that this return of France is extremely paper-thin and short-lived. The Spanish continue administering it all the way up until the Americans actually approach people buying Spanish Louisiana. They actually approach Spanish ministers. They ask, would you mind selling this to us? And the Spanish say, well, it's not ours, hombre. You got to go to the French. So they do. The U.S. buys Louisiana, and bada bing, bada boom, wrapped up nice and neat. Lewis and Clark head out. End of the program. Thank you. Good night. I'm just kidding. But this really turns into another tailspin for the French. They're so excited that France is back. They've got their country back, only for it to be ripped out from under their feet, and now they're Americans. Being French in North America is a very interesting experience. But this is where we come to our good buddies, Lewis and Clark. At one point, if you consider the entire group as a whole, from start to finish, not just the permanent party who went all the way to the ocean and back, at one point, a full quarter of Lewis and Clark's expedition was made up of French heritage individuals here. So you got some of their names here, and these guys are very fascinating as people. They represent a cross-section of New France, the entire story we've been talking about here. You've got guys from Canada. You've got people from Louisiana. You have folks that are products of the fur trade, this middle ground from the three major regions of French activity. From a genealogical standpoint, these guys are also fascinating in that they're all either related by blood, by marriage, or they're friends. So it's a very tight-knit society. Again, 70,000 people spread across most of North America. Odds are you're probably going to know everybody in your immediate vicinity. So just a couple examples of these. Deschamps and Pinot, they're uncle and nephew. Rivet and Hebert, their families are connected by marriage. La Jeunesse and, I believe Primal, they are brothers-in-law. Roy is a personal friend of theirs. He's from Montreal. But all these guys represent sort of this cross-section of New France. But there are some more high-impact members of Lewis and Clark that you probably recognize from the journals. Of course, George Drouillard. He is the son of a Shawnee mother and a French fur-trading father. He's from Detroit. He's a product of the old Ohio country. Cruzat and Labiche, they are mixed-blood sons of the old Louisiana trade. LePage, he is from an old Kaskaskia family. And of course, who can forget everyone's favorite man of no merit, Toussaint Charbonneau himself, from Montreal. And these guys kind of add their own experience, flavor to the Lewis and Clark expedition. They're valuable as interpreters, hunters, boatmen, musicians, cooks. So they're very indispensable for the story of Lewis and Clark. But afterwards, they come back, and the French are still part of this story. Lewis and Clark, that's just a tiny snippet in a very, very big story. And a lot of these guys figure into what happens after. Of course, the fur trade. A lot of these guys are products of the fur trade, and they continue to be so. Some of the individuals with Lewis and Clark connections, we've got Drouillard, LePage, Cruzat, Rivet, and even Primo. One of the first to come up the river with people of French heritage is the mysterious Charles Courtin and John McClellan. They head up the river and are in western Montana in 1807. They're right on the heels of Lewis and Clark. We like to think of John Coulter and his buddies as kind of the first prototypical mountain men. Well, the French are right behind them in their moccasin prints. David Thompson, who is a very famous name in Canadian circles, he almost exclusively uses French and Iroquois, so old Quebec connections. And they head across the Rocky Mountains and end up in northwest Montana in 1807 as well. Establishing Kootenai House, well, not Kootenai House, blah. Never go off your notes for names. Salish House in 1808, Kootenai House is around the same time, but it's in Idaho. And of course, Fort Ramon in 1807 as well, Manuel Lisa, he's a Spaniard from Louisiana. He has a lot of Frenchmen with him, including a couple former Lewis and Clark French. Now, kind of the fate of the French diaspora in North America at this time, it's very varied. And the individuals we've talked about here kind of represent the archetypes for a lot of these fates. Drouillard, Cruzat, and LePage, they die in the Indian country working in the fur trade. Of course, some of them go on to very long careers. Some of them are the beginnings of the Métis, particularly Rivet. He's a fascinating character. He was already about 45 years old when he went with Lewis and Clark. Ended up working with Courtin and McClellan. Ends up jumping ship to work for David Thompson. Works for the Hudson Bay Company. And is actually active in western Montana, parts of the Idaho Panhandle, and eastern Washington into the 1830s and 40s. This guy is in his 60s and 70s, and he's riding out chasing after buffalo, and just really wild character. If you've read the Lewis and Clark journals, you'll know him as the guy that danced on his hands at the Mandan Village. But anyways, he dies in Portland, Oregon in 1852 as a founding father of the future state. But not everybody is as well known as Rivet. Not everybody goes on to do these wonderful things. Labiche, he is actually listed as a winterer into the 1830s and then disappears. Charbonneau, of course, similar story. He's all throughout the fur trade into the 1830s, but he vanishes before he dies. And that's kind of the case with a lot of these fellows. They just drift away into obscurity, and that's sadly kind of what's happened to the French story in North America. You look at the differences between the French in Canada and the French in the United States, it's like night and day. There you still have the Quebecois. It is a vibrant part of the culture out there. You have the Métis. They're recognized as one of the cornerstone indigenous peoples of Canada. Meanwhile, down here, unfortunately, we've got the Cajuns and some folks up in Maine, and that's kind of about it. Our friends, the Missouri French, they've largely been assimilated into American society at large. It's been a case of just different development patterns in the U.S. and Canada. But one is still very prominent and one is kind of hidden today. It's the Lost West. But it's not entirely lost. You guys ever been around looking at geography names, place names of, very famous places? Grand Teton National Park. Look at all the places in Montana with French names. How do you think they got there? It's our French friends involved with the fur trade. Blame the fur trade. But it's still here in those place names. It's still here in French names on and off reservations all across Montana and the West at large. It's present in the Métis. It's present in the Quebecois. The West may have been lost to the French, but the French people, they didn't really go anywhere. They're still here. So that's kind of something that I like to kind of hammer in this program, particularly because of some of the folks with the acknowledgements here. A lot of great books on this topic. I could have probably listed off another 2-3 pages of books that I've used that I just can't even remember at this point. But two very important people to acknowledge here as two very good friends of mine, Matt Hilterman and Amber Paquette. They really kind of helped me realize just how prevalent these French people are in the story of the West. So, special shout out to you guys. And with that, merci beaucoup. I'll free it up for questions, but I wanted to thank you guys for coming out and listening to me gab on about the French for so many minutes. Oh, I should also mention, before you go, feel free to come up here and check out the table. I've got a bunch of reproduction items that relate to this story. So.
Yell. When the guys were going across Nebraska and lost their horses and got robbed, who robbed them?
If I remember correctly, they tried on their second expedition a more southerly route through what is now Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Texas Panhandle. And it's been a little bit, about a year or so since I've read Malat, but I think it was the Comanches that robbed them.
Are the French in Frenchtown Valley and in
Oh.
the Clark Park below Frenchtown,
Yeah, Frenchtown.
newer than that and even newer than?
I believe so. That's mainly a logging town. Oh, yeah. Please repeat the question there. Sorry. Got to get the mic going. Oh, technology. Oh. Well, anyways, the question was regarding the French in Frenchtown, Montana. They're mostly, as far as I know, later arrivals due to logging in the area. Though some of the families, that's a different story on an individual level. There may be ties to some of these earlier families there. It's just a matter of I don't know. They probably do if they've done their genealogy. So, you look like you're thinking there.
Was there much involvement with the French at Bentsport?
A little bit of involvement down there. You're mostly dealing with people from New Spain, so a lot of New Mexican influence, but you do find French influences far south as the Arkansas River. Ironically enough, a very famous fellow that you probably all know if you study Lewis and Clark, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, the little baby. When he was in his 30s and 40s, he actually worked at Bentsport. So, yes?
We have an online question. Is Fort Kana in St. Ignatius Hudson's Bay?
Yes, it is. That is actually the last Hudson Bay Company post operating on U.S. soil. Closed in 1872, run by the famous McDonald family. They factor into a lot of history in the Northwest out there.
What was the question?
Oh, the question was regarding, is Fort Kona a Hudson Bay Company post? And yes, it is. Oh my, mon Dieu, I stumped you. Well, items on the table, okay. Well, a couple things here. I don't know if you can see it with the camera, but these are kind of a typical Eastern-inspired moccasin that you might see on a French person at this time, at least in French Canada. They are kind of a pucker toe vamp style. I base these partially off of a pair that is documented towards the Seneca, so a little Iroquois influence, but they're not perfect, but they're meant to be worn. Of course, one of the most famous pieces of clothing for the French at this time is the toque. The Canadians actually still to this day, they don't call them stocking caps, they don't call them ski caps, they call them toques. So it's just a very warm wool stocking cap that pretty much every image you see of French people in North America in the 18th and 19th century, probably a good 90 to 95% of them are wearing these. They're most commonly red prior to the 19th century. There's a lot of debate over why they start switching to blue in the 19th century. Some people say it's a French Revolution thing. I can't tell you that. Some people just like the color blue. I know that's for me. That's why I got a blue toque. Striking off that middle ground idea, you have a quilled and beaded sort of neck pouch here, kind of hinting to that native influence. And of course, French Catholic with the little rosary there. These pop up everywhere in New France. And last but certainly not least, this sash right here, the L'Assomption sash. These are most commonly associated with the Métis out here, but they are something that you see coming out of Quebec. It's that French-Canadian tradition. It's kind of where it comes from. But you know how I mentioned my friend Matt there? He's the maker of this. Métis historian for the Métis Nation of Alberta, so very talented.
So were people in France wearing those?
Yeah, so, well, not France, New France, I should say. It's really kind of an American thing, like North American. You look at famous images of Quebec in the 1840s and 50s even, and the habitants of the period, famously portrayed by Krieghoff, Cornelius Krieghoff, who actually did this painting, by the way. He shows a lot of habitants wearing the Assumption sash. yeah, it can be used for that. Tons of uses for sashes, and they're just darn pretty things. So,
Didn't have a good reason to haul something along.
oh yeah. And it looks like you had a question back there.
I did. In some of your research, have you come across that 10-year period?
Oh, how can you forget? Yeah, so she's asking about Les Filles du Roi, the daughters of the king. It's just essentially, to put it politely for our folks on YouTube and in the audience, the dregs of French society in the cities. Certain occupations that are very, very old and very sought out by lonely young men and orphans, pickpockets, pretty much anybody that's doing something that the French authorities don't like. Go to Canada. So don't tell the Canadians that. They might get a little embarrassed. But yeah, so that is a very, very fun and raucous story in French-Canadian history. You translate some of the songs that these explorers and boatmen were singing, oh my, they are raunchy. Music hasn't really changed, I'm going to be completely honest. So.
But they were required, the guys that were up there were required to marry.
Yeah.
In order to, do it, right? And so that was kind of the whole purpose.
The whole
They're
purpose
saying
was,
business,
yep.
they married these orphans and
Mm-hmm.
these of these women.
It propagates the colony of Canada, and it serves a social function in France.
And the king paid for them.
Yeah. But it's a very interesting period. Again, 70,000 people versus 1.5 million. That shows you the differences between how France operated its North American colonies and how the British did it. So.
A very silly question.
Oh.
How did the name Canada arrive?
Canada, it's actually an Algonquin word, I believe. It's either Algonquin or Micmac. I can't remember which one right now. But it's the word for village. So what we think happened is the early explorers in Canada were asking, what's the name of this place? And the natives are like, Canada? It's our village, man. What do you want me to say? So, another question to back?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, now, the little shell, the Métis,
Yeah.
are they the same or do they have different bloodlines?
So, that is a very complicated question. Worthy of a program in its own right. Long answer, I will get to. Short answer is yes, they are related. It's a very confusing sort of system of alliances and intermarriages between the Iron Alliance, is what we call it. It's the Métis, the Cree, Assiniboine, and yeah, it's very confusing. Families change identity based off of sometimes how they're feeling in the moment, where they're going, who's the best to hunt with, what's a safer place to be. So it all kind of just changes, which makes for a very fun time for a researcher. Full disclosure, I would not know a darn thing about it if it hadn't been for the help of Amber and Matt. Because they're Métis themselves, and they understand the nuances of that identity greater than I could ever even hope to approach. So. Anyone else? If not, I will definitely say merci beaucoup one more time, and appreciate you all coming out again. It's a good time.